Welcome to Module 2, Part 5 on necessary and sufficient causes. You will need to have the handouts available in front of you. There's a two-page handout. One page looks like this, and the other has voodoo death at the top of the page. So you want to have these in front of you as we walk through this discussion. Alright, well, necessary and sufficient causes. A cause, a little bit of logic here, a cause is said to be necessary if it has to be present for the sickness to occur. So in other words, if the sickness can't happen without that pathogen being introduced in the process somewhere, then that cause or pathogen is said to be necessary. It must necessarily be there. It becomes sufficient if it's the only thing that has to be there. I mean, just think about what the term sufficient means. Nothing else is needed. So if you look at the examples I provided for you, in example A, only one pathogen or some infectious agent, whatever the heck it may be, has to be there. It could be some other cause, some cultural cause. You know, for example, you can suffer a horrible wound from a burn. Whatever. If there's only one cause, one factor present, then it's said to be both necessary, because it has to be there for sickness to occur, and sufficient, because it's the only thing that needs to be there for sickness to occur. So that's the case in number 1. Example number 2, a little bit more complicated. Here we've introduced a second factor, factor B, and we see that we have to have A and B in order to get a sickness. So therefore we would say both A and B are necessary, since they both must be present. However, since there must be something else present as well, we would not call either one of them sufficient. Now, of course, A and B taken as a whole are sufficient because we get sickness. But as far as individual factors, neither one of these is sufficient, but both are necessary. Okay, case C. Here we have pathogen A, or cause A, that must be present, plus either B or C. So we can certainly say that A is necessary, although we would not call A sufficient, since something else is going on as well. Now, in regard to B or C, we can see that sickness can occur without B, and sickness can occur without C. Therefore, neither one of those is said to be necessary. Now, either one or the other is necessary, but neither one in isolation is. So B is neither necessary nor sufficient, and C is neither necessary nor sufficient. The bottom case, here we have A, then plus B or C, plus D or E. So we've extended this out a little bit. So what do we have here? Well, A is necessary, and by the way, none of these causes is sufficient, since there's all sorts of other things going on. So A is necessary, it has to be there, and then either B or C is necessary, and either D or E is necessary. So therefore, neither B, C, D, or E could be considered necessary, and certainly not sufficient. You can see I listed the different scenarios that would actually cause sickness. A plus B plus D, A plus B plus E, A plus C plus D, or A plus C plus E will all cause sickness. Now, we can apply this in an interesting way to the phenomenon known as voodoo death. So if you look at your second handout, voodoo death is supposed death by sorcery. And I say supposed because anthropologists, of course, do not accept the fact that people die solely from sorcery. Sorcery is magic done with the intent to harm. Anthropology first came across this phenomenon in Australia amongst the Aborigines, where a shaman or a sorcerer would point a bone at some individual, and that individual would increasingly get more and more sick, and after a few days would actually expire, would actually die, ostensibly from the power of the sorcery. Well, Cannon, an anthropologist with some medical training, actually looked into this phenomenon, and he suspected that there was something a bit more corporeal, or something a bit more mundane or ordinary going on. And in fact, something called Occam's razor is quite useful to us here. William of Occam, English philosopher, argued that when faced with some bizarre occurrence or some bizarre event, and if we're trying to explain it, we should first exhaust all natural explanations before resorting to supernatural ones. This is a perfect test case, and Cannon applied Occam's razor, O-C-C-A-M''S. Cannon applied Occam's razor here, and he discovered, in fact, that people were expiring for mundane reasons. And of course, people have looked into this phenomenon quite a bit since that time, and we've eventually been able to put two and two together and figure out what's happening. When the individual has the hex put on them, they will retire to their homestead, to their tent, and their social network slowly begins to pull away from them, because this person is now, quote unquote, the undead. They're somewhere between being alive and dead. They're in that sort of gray area between being fully alive and fully dead. And so their social network and their support group slowly begins to pull away from them. And in fact, even the burial preparations will begin while the person is still alive. So those two factors, I mean, the fact that people are preparing for your burial, you've lost your support system, that's enough to induce a very serious psychological trauma. And then to heighten the effect, the individual stops eating, which is not quite so problematic, but then they also stop taking fluids. They stop drinking water. And of course, the human body can't go very long without water. You know, the blood volume drops out of sight, causing all sorts of issues. So anyway, long story short, a combination of the psychological and physiological trauma actually work together to kill the individual for reasons that are quite understandable. Now, on your paper you see emic, etic, and the anthropological perspective. Let me explain what these mean. An emic view, or an emic perspective, is an insider's perspective. In other words, a cultural, quote-unquote, perspective based on the cultural ideology of the area in question. So the N and the S, by the way, refer to necessary and sufficient, as you probably guessed. So from the emic perspective, in other words, from the perspective of the Australians themselves, we're talking the Aborigines here, the sorcery, the magic, in other words, is both necessary and sufficient to cause death. They assume the magic is powerful, a person is being punished for good reason, and the power of the magic and the sorcery is enough to kill someone. So the sorcery is both necessary and sufficient in that case. Well, an etic perspective is an outsider's perspective. In other words, someone totally outside the culture that knows nothing about the culture. What are they seeing? And they would see what Cannon and other anthropologists have described. They would see that this person is suffering from psychological and physiological trauma, and not surprisingly, they will die in a few days. And so from the etic, or outsider's perspective, the physiological and psychological trauma, what I'm calling factor B here, is both necessary and sufficient. That's all we need in order to bring about death. But now, anthropologists have the task of understanding what's going on both culturally and universally. Because after all, anthropology is the study of humans as biocultural organisms. And so anthropology would take a more holistic perspective, and they would see things like this. An anthropologist, of course, recognizes that the person expired due to psychological and physiological trauma. However, the anthropologist would also point out that these things would not occur in the absence of the sorcery. So without the sorcery, people aren't expiring like this. So, for example, anthropologists go there and study the Australian Aborigines, and even if they were subject to bone-pointing sorcery, they would not die. So therefore, from the point of view of anthropology, the cultural ideology, the sorcery, is a necessary factor. And obviously, they also recognize that the person physiologically expires from trauma that's caused by lack of eating and drinking and the loss of support group and so forth, and that's also a necessary factor. Thus, the anthropological perspective, I guess we could say, is a bit more holistic, since of course they recognize the human universals, but they must also delve into cultural ideology as well to understand cultural phenomena.